Hello everyone, this is pattern making for creators, and in this video we'll see how to sew this blouse. As you can see, it's an oversized shirt-like blouse. Start preparing the front pieces. There are pretty large pieces, and on the top area you can see some notches marking where the pleats go, alongside the notches on the bottom of the garment. Using a long ruler or measuring tape, join the top and bottom notches with a straight line so that you have all four pleat reference lines on the inside of the garment. Next, with a thread of a color that stands out, you have to base the lines you've just marked. This way, they'll also be visible from the outside of the garment. You can also mark with thread the buttons positions or any other marking that will help you sew the garment. Regarding the interfacing, on the front piece only the placket area will be interfaced. There are some notches marking where the placket begins. Cut a fusible interfacing rectangle and, with the iron, glue it to the placket. You can also interface the opening area of the cuffs, as well as the two collar pieces. Overlock the sides of the body, both the front and back. For marking the pleat, place the fabric with its right side facing you and bring the second line from the side to the first line, so that the pleat will be pointing to the center front of the garment. Press it with the iron. Hold the pleat with pins. Now it's time to sew it with stitching. Do so inside the pleat. You have to have that line marked with the iron. The stitching will go on this line. You also have to pass a straight stitching 1 cm from the center front, top to bottom. Once the pleat stitching has been done, add markings every 18 cm from the shoulder downwards, and, on those markings, make some small hand stitches so the pleat can't unfold. This last step is optional. Following with the front placket, make a first fold towards the inside of the garment with that 1 cm gap from the edge, using the stitching you made earlier as a guide. Then, fold the placket inwards where the notches marking the center of the placket are. These notches are placed on the top and bottom of the pattern. Hold them with pins until it's time to sew it, both on the top and bottom of the garment. Save the front pieces for later and take the back pieces. You can see the back neckline is made to have a pretty large pleat. It's marked with notches. The shape of the back neckline contour is already marking how the pleats should be done. This part I'm doing now is inside. You have to hold both notches matching the center back and pass a stitching top to bottom. Make it so that it's about 4 or 5 cm long. As mentioned earlier, the stitching should match the center back once the pleat is pressed. On the outside of the garment, the pleat should look like this. Sew the front and back pieces together by the sides. Place the pieces right to right and pass stitching by seam allowance top to bottom. You don't have to reach down to the bottom end. You have a notch marking the beginning of an opening. From that notch downwards, the garment should remain open. You also have to sew the shoulder seam now. Place the pieces right to right, pass a stitching by seam allowance, and overlock both pieces in one go. This is differently than on the side, because on the side they've been overlocked before sewing them together. Press the side seam open and the shoulder seam towards the back. Now you can sew the front placket and all the bottom line. Starting from the neckline, you can go down sewing all the white hem on the placket, and, as you get closer to the bottom, turn and make the bottom hem. Turn it once and turn it again to have a double hem. The pleat area may be a bit harder because there will be plenty of fabric gathered in there. But with patience, it can be done. It's a pretty small part. There's 1.5 centimeters to do this hem. Once you reach the opening on the side, you'll have to pass the stitching above the 1 centimeter seam allowance you folded inwards and which is overlocked. Go up, following one side of the opening, and go down the other side of the opening, so that in a single go you can start on the placket on one side of the front, make the whole bottom, the back, the other side of the front, and go up the other placket and have the whole contour of the garment sewn in a single stitching. If it's easier for you to stop between parts, you can do so, don't worry. Once the hem is done, press it and let's move to the sleeve. As you can see, it's a pretty wide sleeve. Let's work the open area first. To do so, you have a pattern piece you have to insert to the sleeve piece. The piece for the opening has to be interfaced. On the pattern, there's a line marking where the opening of the sleeve goes, and that same line is on the piece for the opening. Then, there are other notches which, when joined to the ones on the top and bottom of the piece, will mark where to fold the piece itself. You have to make the guideline of the opening to match both on the sleeve and the other piece. Place the piece of the opening on top of the inside of the sleeve. Do it so that both pieces have their rights facing each other, and with the white part of the piece for the opening the closest to the center. You can see it here. With a machine stitching, make a kind of box or rectangle around the opening. The stitching has to be 0.5 centimeter from this guideline on both sides of it. Then, you have to fold both sides of the piece by the fold line you have marked thanks to the notches. Cut by the guideline and stop 1 centimeter before reaching the top. On the top, and the cut diagonally on both sides, making a triangle, to reach the corners of the rectangle you made with the stitching. Pull the piece to the right of the sleeve. The seam allowance has to be pointing towards the fold of the piece so that you can now bind the seam allowances with these two fabric rectangles. The thinnest one will be the one on the bottom, and the wider one will be the decorative one. On the wider rectangle, you can cut the top part 1 cm shorter, but only on this side I'm doing now, and always leaving a gap, or extra fabric, from the folding point. On the small rectangle, fold the seam allowance inwards, and you'll end with a 1 cm wide piece inserted there. Fix it with a stitching top to bottom. It's just as if you had used a bias tape to bind the edge of a piece. Do the same thing on the other side, but the rectangle will be much wider. You'll also have to fold the top seam allowance of the piece inwards. Fix the top piece with a stitching. Now start making a horizontal seam where the top piece steps the edge of the bottom piece. Once you reach the other side, keep contouring towards the top of the piece. And finally, go down until this whole sandwich you've done with the top of the shirt opening is fixed. The next step will be making the pleats. Join both notches and both markings on the respective pleats and pass stitching top to bottom. Hold these markings with pins. The fabric of the pleats will be pressed towards the opening, pointing to the back. Overlock the sides of the sleeve. Place the sides right to right, pass stitching by similar ones top to bottom, and press the seam open. On the cuffs, you have to have the buttons positions marked in a way in which they are visible. Take one of the pieces, align the black notch with the white opening a piece, and from there, hold the whole contour of the waistline with pins. You'll see the similar ones of the cuffs sticking out on the side of the opening. Press the cuffs upwards of the garment, and the similar ones should now be pointing towards the cuff. Grab the other cuff piece and face it right to right with the previous one, aligning the whole top contour. You'll have to pass stitching from one side to the other, following the curved shape of the cuff. Once the stitching has been done, you can cut the seam allowance down so it's just half centimeter wide, or you can just notch it. Turn the cuff and press the whole contour. Finally, from inside the garment, fold the seam allowance towards the inside of the cuff. Use the stitching that's visible so the seam allowance is well lined. This could be fixed with a straight machine stitching contouring the whole cuff. But I want a cleaner, seamless look to it. So I'll just sew it with hand slip stitches, leaving the cuff tightly sewn from inside the garment. The cuff is finished, but we still have to add the buttons and buttonholes to it. Let's now sew the sleeve to the body. Align the side of the seam of the sleeve with the side seam of the body. Place the pieces right to right. Once this point is held in place, you'll work the positioning of the sleeve better from the inside the garment. So you'll have to align the front and back armholes notches as well as the shoulder knots. You have to be careful here. The shoulder knots on the sleeve must match the shoulder knots on the body. And the shoulder knots on the body is this one you see here, and not the seam it has on to the front. Anyways, it's all marked with letters. Hold the contour with pins, pass stitching by seam allowance, overlock both fabric pieces together, and press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. The last important thing to do is the shirt collar. You'll have to follow the same method you've used for sewing the cuff. First, sew the top of the collar, placing both pieces right to right, and passing stitching by the sides and top areas. The bottom will remain open so you can later turn it inside out. Press its contour. Then, grab one of the collar stand pieces and place it on the right of the body neckline. From the center back towards the center front, you have the two shoulder notches and the placket notch to properly align the contour of the piece. Once it all held in place, pass stitching by seam allowance. Notch the whole neckline curve and press the seam allowance upwards towards the collar piece. Grab the collar top piece again and place it right to right, aligning its contour to the upper contour of the collar stand, matching their notches too. Finally, take the other collar stand piece and place it right to right, This way, the upper collar piece will be in between the two collar stand pieces. Pass a stitching from one side of the front to the other side of the front, passing through the back and sewing all three pieces together. On the front curved area, leave a half a centimeter seam allowance and notch the rest of the seam. Turn the piece inside out so that the top part of the collar is visible again. Finish the bottom of the collar stand, just like you did on the cuff. Fold the seam allowance inwards, guiding yourself with the stitching you've done. Press it thoroughly, hold it with pins, and finish closing it by hand. Just like before, this piece could also be finished with a machine stitching. It would be visible on the garment, but it would also be stronger than finishing it by hand. It's fully optional. They're really just a standard shirt collar and cuffs. They're sewn in the same way you'd sew them in any other shirt. The design of these parts in itself has nothing special that requires a specific sewing method. With that, the garment is fully sewn. The only thing left would be adding the buttonholes and buttons. You can see the markings to place the buttons on the pattern. You could have marked them in thread at the beginning, but I prefer making these markings when it's time to sew them. The buttons will always be placed in the center of the front placket. In this case, my placket is 5 cm wide, so they'll be placed 2.5 cm from the edge. You can place them, as I said, following the pattern, or by placing the first button 2 cm away from the collar seam and, from there, measuring downwards the separation you want them to have. And that's because, depending on how big the button you're using is, you could change how far apart they are. Furthermore, it's also a personal aesthetics choice. Let's put them with a gap between buttons of 14 centimeters. On the other hand, right in the middle of the collar stand and following the line you have on the shirt placket, place another button. On the opposite side, you'll have to place the buttonholes. Because the placket is quite wide, you could make them either vertical or horizontal. I, personally, will make them vertically on the center front and horizontally for the collar and cuffs. Follow the exact same process for the cuffs. And here we end the second of this blouse. If you like it, see you again in future pattern videos.